your house is going to see 2.5 meters of water in the next 3 hours. It will come from this direction. It will stay for an hour. But since it appears that you have mud mortar walls, it may be best to evacuate. The best house to go to may be house, which is 2 buildings away, but it's a concrete house with 3 stories. So, and this is the best route that you can take, or any center
Wow.
that we point to. That's what we have the capability to do as of today in affordable costs.
Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host Punit Gandhi, and Climate Center for Cities is excited to bring to you a podcast about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, sustainability, and innovation. We will talk to experts working on ground as well as in the top management of government and non-governmental organizations to better understand how their field looks like in future. This will help us in preparing to enable climate actions as well as gauge the type of skill sets and jobs that would be required in future to solve complex challenges. If you are listening to it for the first time, do tune into season 1.
Hello, and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host, Punit Gandhi, and today we have with us Dr. Anshu Sharma. He is the co founder of Sustainable Environment and Ecological Development Society called SEEDS. He will help us understand about disaster resilience in the cities. Welcome to the show, Dr. Anshu.
Thank you, Puneet. A great pleasure being here. And hello, everyone.
First, I would like to congratulate you for your award that you received recently, Subhash Chandra Bose Apda Prabandhan Puraskar in 2021. Thank you for your service on those lines.
Thank
Uh,
you. It's a privilege.
let's start talking about disaster resilience. But before that, let's try and understand what do we mean by disaster? What are we talking about disaster, and what is it in urban context as of now?
So, I think that's a great starting point. And yeah, while there are many official definitions with a lot of jargon in them, but fundamentally, I think we are all good if we can understand and be on the same page that disaster is fundamentally an issue of capacity to deal with anything that goes wrong.
Yeah,
Even in colloquially in life, there are very small things that you call disasters. You're
yeah,
going for work and you spill coffee on your shirt. You say, "Oh God, that's a disaster," right? But you have
yeah,
another shirt in your cupboard. It just takes another minute and you change it,
yeah,
and that's well and good. But if you were entering an interview room and you spill the same coffee on your shirt, then it's a
yeah,
little more difficult because you don't have a cupboard and you don't have another shirt. So, that being a very simple day-to-day kind of an example, I think the part of how we define a disaster that we all need to understand is that it's so much to do with your capacity to manage something that has gone wrong.
yeah,
So if in a neighborhood or in an apartment block or in a slum, something happens,
yeah,
a fire incident happens, somebody falls ill, but people around him or her are able to pull the resources together and respond and take care of that situation, I
yeah,
think we are good, right? It's an adverse event that got managed.
yeah,
The moment it goes outside the capacity of that group of people or that institution to manage, that's when it enters the realm of disasters. Even by definition, we say that you're not able to manage the situation and you're having to call for outside help.
yeah,
So now one part is the definition side, but the other part, and I think we'll talk a lot more about this today, is instead of focusing almost entirely on how you will respond and what nature of the disaster can occur,
yeah,
I think the focus primarily needs to be on how your capacities are doing and how much you can do to bump those up, because the bar at which your system fails depends on your capacity as much as
yeah,
it depends on the nature of the event. So that's like a very generic setting the line of where we need to be
yeah,
and get ourselves there. But you mentioned cities. So I think in terms of cities, this becomes a little more critical, because so far, as with any other learning system, we have been learning based on past trends and past
yeah,
experiences, right? So those experiences are way more, established, and they have been longer term in rural contexts.
Yeah.
We have seen more disasters. We've seen the ecosystem evolve. There are people who are deep rooted, institutions that are deep rooted.
Yeah.
Rural societies have themselves seen so much and learned from it and improved over time that there's a lot of traditional wisdom also that comes into play. So, a lot of our institutional learning, formal and informal both, is primarily in the rural domain.
Yeah.
Urbanization by virtue itself is a newer phenomenon, but more critically, at present, in fact, as per the last census, which was 10 years ago, we have about 8,000 cities,
Yeah.
7,935 to be precise, right?
Yeah.
A majority of these 8,000 cities are growing very fast.
Yeah.
The bigger ones are growing faster,
Yeah.
and a majority of them are growing without any plans.
True.
It's fairly shocking for someone who's not from the sector to realize that about three-fourths of the cities have been growing without any development plans. In
Yeah.
fact, till a few years ago, we didn't even have base maps for many of our cities. A very basic map was not available. Nowadays, of course, we download from Google and we can
Yeah.
do a lot with technology. But it's cities that are growing really fast. It's where half of the country is living, and the share will go on increasing, and
Yeah.
they don't have a plan, right?
Yeah.
So the result is that, one, we don't know what capacity we have to deal with a large scale adverse event.
True.
Secondly, by the time we try to understand what's happening in a city and try to contain risk or reduce risk, different ways, safety of buildings, the infrastructure, emergency response, police, fire, hospitals, everything. By
Yeah.
the time you try to fix something, there's a lot more of risk that has been built, particularly in the informal sectors that are growing very rapidly. So let me pause here, but I would say that this is the domain we are dealing with. It's very fuzzy.
Yeah.
There are some definitions and some systems that float around, but real life is far more complicated than it appears in a disaster management model.
Yeah.
And a lot of the stuff we deal with is very physical, photographical, but there's a lot more that happens, which is behavioral, as we are seeing with the COVID second wave right now,
True.
that we need to deal with.
Yeah, I know. I do understand, and this again comes up. I think now better for me as well because I have been involved in this ecosystem or urban planning ecosystem for last 2.5 years now, and that kind of brings me to the point where okay, now I understand this is disaster and this is the kind of problems it causes. But when we traditionally, like at least from the disaster management perspective, we are looking at it, we kind of divided, and during the research I found that we kind of divided into a couple of things. That we first look at it from preparedness perspective, then what do we plan when the disaster happens, how do we plan things, then immediate response and recovery, and then comes rehabilitation. So how, if you can explain each of these in a context which can help our audience understand better what is the journey of the whole disaster management.
So let me try to do this with an example. I think that may
Sure.
help us best. So when I was starting my career, in the very early lessons for me was to travel down to Andhra Pradesh.
Yeah.
And in the 90s, Andhra Pradesh was a noted and quoted case study because Andhra had done a lot on disaster preparedness, including deployment of technology, plans, community groups, and all.
Hmm.
So as I moved around and met people and I read about it, the story that comes out is that in 1977, there was a major cyclone in Andhra Pradesh.
Hmm.
Completely devastated the coastline. Over 10,000 people are reported to have been killed. Uh, and the systems were completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Following that, the state government of Andhra Pradesh took upon itself to fix systems, right? So management plans were made down to every last village. There were committees and teams that were set up. They were trained. A communication system was set up that would even work when physical lines go down through ham
Yeah.
radio and stuff like that. Now, in 1996, another cyclone struck the area. It
Hmm.
was almost as severe as the 77 one, a little lower than
Yeah.
that. But the impact it created was a fraction of what had happened in 1977. There
Okay.
was impact on the landscape, also on buildings, but a huge number of lives could be saved because people responded. There was some organized way of doing it. People evacuated. There was a warning, uh, and life loss was in a few hundreds.
Yeah.
So let me now break this down into two or three lessons that can be drawn, which form this context of different kinds of preparedness that you can do.
Yeah.
Firstly, disasters uh, as a trigger event, which we would otherwise call a hazard. Unless it kills people and destroys buildings, it's not a disaster. Charles Richter, in the context of earthquakes, he's the founder of
Yeah.
the inventor of the Richter, after whom the Richter scale is named, and the
Yeah.
seismograph. He had famously quoted, "Earthquakes don't kill people, buildings do."
Yeah.
Right. So
Correct.
with that same elaboration, we'll say that the cyclones may keep occurring, and they will keep occurring. And now we know for sure with IMD, telling us scientifically that cyclones are getting stronger with every passing decade.
Yeah.
But you can reduce losses. So firstly, it's cyclic. And so the related model in disaster management is also called the disaster management cycle.
Mm.
But it's cyclic. It will come. You may have forgotten the last pandemic because it happened 100 years ago, and now
Yeah.
it shocks us. We may have forgotten the last tsunami because it had happened a few hundred years ago, before
Yeah.
the 2004 one came, and it again shocked us. So periodicities may be different. Annual floods happen every year and we remember them very well, but almost all the hazards are cyclic.
Yeah.
And between cycles is the opportunity to learn and improve. Now, by default, when an adverse event happens, you will respond, you will look for people, you will do search and rescue, you will provide first aid, medical response, you will give them food aid, shelter relief, tent bhi lagayenge, all of those things will happen.
Yeah.
So there will be a during emergency or immediately after the emergency kind of response. There will be a slightly longer term response from a few days to a few weeks or months.
Yeah.
Then you enter what is called the recovery phase, where you start rebuilding gradually. Maybe initially you'll do temporary structures, schools, houses, health
Yeah.
centers, and all. Then you'll go on to longer term recovery and rehabilitation, which will mean not only reconstruction of the infrastructure and buildings, but also rehabilitating people's lives, their livelihoods, helping those who've been thrown off gear
Yeah.
economically, and so on. And once all of that has happened, and hopefully you have done this in a way that the the setting is now better and safer than it was before the disaster,
Yeah.
which now is called build back better.
Yeah.
When you have to build back, do it better than it was last time. So hopefully when you've done that and done it well, is the time to start thinking of the next one, right?
Yeah.
In fact, now we say you should start thinking of the next one even while the first one is wrapping up, because you never know how much the gap between these cyclic events is.
True.
So when you've done that, or ideally right from earlier stages, you would be doing what was earlier called disaster prevention in the 90s.
Hmm.
Then we realized that you can't prevent disaster, so we called it disaster
Preparedness.
mitigation and preparedness. And the
Yeah.
difference between mitigation and preparedness being that under mitigation, you would take actions which would reduce the possibility of impact from that hazard.
Yeah.
So, for example, if there is a fire risk in an urban slum settlement, you would try to switch to non-flammable
Yeah.
building materials. You would try to remove the extra fuel like garbage dumps and all. So you would reduce the fire incident itself. And preparedness, on the other hand, would include measures that assume that the incident will happen, and
Mm.
then you will respond better and quickly. So a fire extinguisher, or a small fire engine, or a first aid kit, and people trained to respond, is a preparedness measure. So that's how they were distinguished. And then with the UN coming in a very big way, and all member states
Mm.
measuring up to that, with a series of world conferences and commitments that have happened, we are now living through what is called the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So it was further broken down. Reducing risk was seen from the lens of having good governance, a
Yeah.
governance system that understands risk and plans accordingly, budgets accordingly, good science that is able to anticipate and do early warnings and education, good dissemination along with that education, and investment in all of these
Yeah.
strategies. Also going down to finer details of underlying risks. Climate change is being spoken about a lot,
Yeah.
But till date, the climate change conversation and the disaster conversation have much lesser interface than they need to. They're very, very deeply connected as natural phenomena, but we are still managing them differently. We have different
Yeah.
ministries in charge. We have different agencies that are working. We have different departments in universities that are researching and teaching these. So that's the kind of in exchange that this underlying risk priority tries to build. And finally, we say prepare. It will happen despite your best efforts. Things will go wrong. Be prepared how you will respond, and be prepared to even build back and make sure that you build back better. So that's how we see this cycle. There are, of course, many graphic representations. There are many theories that our viewers can look at, very easy to find online. But I think it works best when you set it in a real life context and you see
Yeah.
yourself how you've handled a couple of different things in life, difficult things in life, and how you've learned and improved. I think what we are trying to do in this domain is to make that learning and improvement a little more conscious, a little more efficient, a little more,
Yeah.
system wide rather than ad hoc.
Yeah.
Puneet.
No, I do resonate with your point over there because I have personally experienced two floods in Surat, 98 and 2006. I do distinctly remember how in the 2006, while the waters were, I think, a bit more than 98, but still the infrastructure was brought in at the point where your mud and all your sludge was taken off as quickly as possible. You proper chlorination of things, bleach were thrown everywhere so that you don't get uh, post disaster diseases and all spread through. And that is the kind of difference I think build back better does bring into picture. Now when we
Yeah.
look at Indian context, we have eastern coast where major amount of cyclones come into picture, western state where also there is quite a lot of cyclones, but again, uh, I think on the western side there are a lot of big cities, so flooding happens much more than on the eastern. I might be wrong here, and this is just coming from layman's perspective. On the north, we have tectonic plates, so earthquake happens a bit more, especially in the mountainous regions, which causes different kind of disasters over there. So, do we have some kind of plan in action for cities over there that okay, they are much aware that okay, this is the higher possibility over here, so maybe they are more prepared for earthquakes than floods and something on those lines?
Okay, so let me answer this in two parts, and I'm just sharing thoughts. I mean, there's no
Sure,
clear
sure,
answer for many of
sure, sure.
these questions. But firstly, I think we must acknowledge that a lot has happened in the last 20 odd years.
Yeah,
The government has really moved. There is a national act, there's a national plan, there's a national
yeah,
policy on disaster management. All states have got their acts and plans in place. Districts are having their own plans and authorities to make this happen. And in, I think, almost all states, there has been a concerted effort even to have city disaster management plans. So even some of the cities, when I was alluding to cities growing without plans, while they may be growing without plans, we are, as a society, as a nation, realizing that there needs to be
yeah,
more conscious work on making these cities safer, even if they're growing without a plan, right? So
yeah,
that's happening in a number of places, and I think that's the good news that we have. While we do this, the slightly tricky part is what often, some people would call the curse of knowledge. So we think we figured things out. We know, we've got data, we've got satellites, we've got
yeah,
early warning, and we think we figured it out. But what nature's been doing consistently is telling us that we still have a lot to learn.
yeah,
So, in fact, if we look back at the last 15, 16 years, let's start from the Mumbai floods, which was the
yeah,
first time that India saw such an urban event.
yeah,
Till then, floods was something that happens in rural Bihar, Orissa, West Bengal. You see it in images, on
yeah,
newspapers, in
yeah,
the headlines. You see poor people, a family, and a few goats stuck on a thatch roof and waving to a helicopter and water. That was the image of floods in
yeah,
India. When people walking on that little median, in
yeah,
the center of the road, and the roads flooded and buses inundated and people dying, drowning in cars in Bombay, it kind of hit us slow in the face. We weren't prepared for this. This was not the
True.
image of floods as we knew it, right? We called it unprecedented.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, in coming years, we saw very similar scenes coming from Chennai, coming from Kochi, coming from Srinagar in Kashmir,
Yeah.
Surat,
Yeah.
where you have seen this happen, Bhopal. So unprecedented urban floods became very frequent,
Yeah.
right? So and then we had floods in Badmer in Rajasthan in the Thar Desert
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
killed people. And we said in 200 years this has never happened. 200 years basically meant recorded history. That's when we
Yeah.
started keeping records. So in recorded history we had never seen such a flood, but it happened. The very next year, Assam, which annually sees floods, was seeing a drought. And droughts affect cities because, I mean, some people have started calling it the urban drought or urban water stress, because there is a huge footprint that the city has ecologically. It
Yeah.
needs to consume. And when there is a drought in the region, there is a whole socioeconomic impact, because people then look to the city for food, for employment, there's migration, and all kinds of problems pop up. So now everything was getting thrown off the gear. Then in 2010, you had the flash floods in Leh, in Ladakh, the
Yeah.
mountain desert, right? Uh, so, so, so one, the way the climate is changing, especially so, and that would relate to all hydrometeorological events, floods and droughts and cyclones and storms and heat
Yeah.
waves and cold waves. The way the climate is changing, it has become impossible to project the future based on past trends. And all of us in the planning world, whether we are economists or urban planners or regional planners, we are trained to work with past trends. 1901, you start and you make a graph. Oh, this is how the population grew, so this is how it will grow.
Yeah.
This is how disaster events happen, and they are increasing, so they will go on increasing at the same rate. This is
Yeah.
how the economy grew, so this will grow, it will go, right? So we were assuming that trends is the safest way to plan. And then we would, try to play god with it and say, okay, there can be an accelerated growth model or there can be a decelerated growth model, but it's a little band in which you can move. The trend is going to be followed.
Yeah.
Now trends will not be followed. And with what we are seeing in the last year, even trends on the way cities grow will not be followed. It is not imperative to be in the city center to be able to work in organizations that are based over there.
Yeah.
You can now be way away from your workplace, because you may be required to come only twice a week, not
Yeah.
only as long as the pandemic lasts, but even beyond that. There are organizations that have started giving up their office space, selling their office buildings, not because they don't have the money, but because they've seen that they will not need that space even after the pandemic. So the city growth model is going to change. The
Yeah.
infrastructure is going to get dispersed. People's requirements will change. Transportation requirements will change. Energy being consumed by the cloud will change.
Yeah.
Data centers will rewrite how we, live. And given all of this, plus the fact that climate change is already changing the hazards that lurk around us,
Yeah.
it's very difficult to anticipate the future.
True.
So we are at a point where a lot more needs to be done, and it
Yeah.
is being done. There are very intelligent people and institutions putting up very intelligent models to figure out how this can play out. Forecasts, which used to be earlier very long term, we've lived with a 20-year horizon master plan for too long.
Yeah.
The master plan approach should have died decades ago, but it's there's no way it can survive anymore. Cities will change so fast
Yeah.
that you will literally have to plan and execute in real time. And that's something that we'll have to imbibe even as individuals who live in cities and those who work for cities, and to get the cities going and keep them working. We'll have to understand that this master plan thinking and the approach where we can model and know what the future is going to be like is
Yeah.
not going to work. It will change, and we have to change with it. Puneet.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, that the change is too fast for it to follow any trends anymore. It's no longer linear. I'm not even sure how exponential it is. It's going up now. And not just in case of disaster, but every other kind of change that we are looking at. So when we are then talking about disasters, the first people to respond to it generally in the cities are your fire services. police services and hospital. Like I believe fire services before police and hospital sometimes, but how are they given capacity to deal with such things? What kind of trainings and structures do they have which help them prepare for it in a better way?
Okay, so let's talk about the structures they have and how it is seen, and then for a few moments, let's talk about what needs to change with the changing world around us. So, how do we need to see that structure
That
change?
sounds perfect.
A few years ago, there was a massive study conducted by the National Disaster Management Authority. NIDM was anchoring it. Seeds, where I come from,
Yeah,
did some part of that work. And one of the objectives was to figure out how many people in India need to be trained on disaster management. Right?
yeah,
So it seems like a very simple question. It's very, very difficult to break it down.
yeah,
And then you start thinking who all needs to be trained. And you may want to start from the parliamentarians because that's where laws are written. That's
yeah,
where stuff happens. Then you want to talk about the economists and people sitting in the commissions that deal with finance and planning because money needs to be allocated. So many times there are plans, but they can't be executed क्योंकि उसका budget तो आया नहीं था. So people need to be executed right at the top level. Then people need to be executed who run the different sectors for the country. Health, of course, we are seeing nowadays critical player in disaster management. Uh, Transportation, communications, power, education, all of these sectors will have a role. It's a cross-cutting thing. There's no single sector which can say that I don't deal with disasters, so I don't need to have a plan or a budget for it, right? So it needs to go all across. So we had a list of about 13, 14 odd categories that went down to local groups and community volunteers.
okay,
And while that was not the largest number, and it included the media, it included the private sector, uh, 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 and all of this total to about 13 million people that need to be trained on disaster management in India. That was the government figure. And the plan was to try and do it within 5 years. The five
wow,
years have kind of run out. A lot has happened, a lot is still to be done, but that's the scale and the complexity of this system. And there was a huge emphasis on urban within this study
yeah,
and these numbers, right? So now, while I think you started at the exact point where it needs to start is the fire people, the first responder. Like the fire brigade is often the first responder.
yeah,
They would rescue you from a well, from when you're stuck in a flood,
yeah,
to the rooftop of a building that is on fire, to stuck on a tree or whatever, odd kind of things also they respond to, but they're the first responder. Then, of course, the police is there to support for certain functions and to make sure that the links can happen. And then, of course, the medical first response is there,
yeah,
which is why now we don't have those traditional telephone directories, but these were the three numbers that were always written,
yeah,
on those and everywhere else right from the beginning. So that happens. But then again, as we are seeing now, behind these front lines that respond, there's an entire machinery that needs to be well oiled.
yeah,
As we are seeing with the demand for COVID response in the health sector these days. So it needs to be scalable, and especially when you're talking about cities, then our capacity to deal with mass casualties needs to be there. I
yeah,
remember again many years ago when this Upar cinema hall in Delhi had caught a fire, very unfortunate
yeah,
incident. A few dozen people died. Uh, it was really bad, although still not a mass casualty scenario that we try to sketch when we talk of an earthquake, for example, in Delhi.
yeah,
But I remember I was still in college at that time, Puneet. I was at the School of Planning and Architecture, and I had a scooter. I couldn't drive back home. There was a city-wide traffic jam. And of
wow,
course, I couldn't get into a bus. I tried to hitch a ride and something, but then eventually I walked 6 kilometers to get home, which was near INA Market,
yeah,
because the whole city was in a gridlock because one cinema hall had caught fire. Right?
shit,
Now, imagine if there's an earthquake and there's 100 buildings that have got damaged or collapsed or on fire, and all your road signals are not working because there's no power, your communication lines are down, there is a city-wide traffic jam. That's, it's eerie to think about what would happen. And eerie is the word, in fact, that comes to my mind. Is probably not the best word, but it comes from another experience. So I was in Haiti after a massive
Mhm.
earthquake
Yeah.
that happened there about a decade ago. And the one thing of the many things that I saw, including collapsed hospitals and stuff like that, but the one thing that stays with me is was talking to these local people and said, how was it like right after the earthquake? They said it was eerie because there was complete silence.
Yeah.
Since all the entire power grid was down, there were no traffic signals working, so there was an instant traffic jam. Within a few minutes, all the vehicles had been switched off and nobody could move from anywhere to anywhere. There was no machinery running, there was no vehicle running. There were no people making a noise because they said everyone was looking very busy and walking silently. Everyone had to get somewhere
Yeah.
and they were quietly just walking. There were like thousands of 10 thousands of people just walking on the streets quietly.
Yeah.
And it struck me, when you think of earthquakes, you only think of very cinematic kind of screen, people screaming and things falling, but you
Yeah.
don't imagine that after 5 minutes there's pin drop silence in the city because nothing is working
Yeah.
and people are just walking from one place to the other to find their loved ones or get home or whatever. So I think, a long winding answer, but looking at the scale of the problem that we are staring at in the future,
Yeah.
it would be very narrow minded and narrow visioned to be just looking at the police and fire and the ambulances and others.
Yeah.
The quote that we often use, and from Gujarat Times, is that you and your neighbor are your most dependable first responders in a disaster. So if
Oh,
you want to talk about capacity building, let's start from you and your neighbor because he's
yeah.
or she's going to come for you and you're going to go for him or her. And that's
Yeah.
where response will really happen. People will be rescuing each other with their bare hands when that day arrives. God forbid it arrives soon enough, but one day it will. And that's the image we need to have when we talk about response and capacities. We can't put that on the shoulders of the government alone, Puneet.
Yeah. Oh, that does sound eerie to me right now as well. Like it, and it's something that you can't even imagine. I feel being a first responder as well as being calm over there and trying to help people out. So coming to the other side of the story is on how now technology is kind of facilitating a lot of things. So I was talking to a friend recently and we were discussing that how they helped in mapping. So when the Nepal earthquake came and they were like working from India trying to map the whole GIS map voluntarily, and there is certain kind of things that comes and goes on those lines which at least helps first responders from across the world to also help in some format or the other. Can you give a highlight on those lines, that what kind of technology interventions are now coming up, and how does it help in all these activities?
So, okay, now we are entering a space where there's a lot of excitement and positivity, I feel, because that's you know the strength of the human spirit is what keeps us going. It's kept us going
Yeah.
for centuries, for generations. There may be huge challenges all around us right now, including the climate emergency that we're facing. But I'm a
Yeah.
strong believer that we'll find a way out, and we'll find a way out through ingenuity, through innovations and technology. So, very rightly said, and this happened like 5 6 years ago in after the Nepal earthquake, and
Yeah.
I remember some of those maps, and I remember having interacted with some of those. I mean, I would call them kids who would stay up
Yeah.
all night to literally work pixel by pixel and identify every single building that had collapsed, on those mountainsides. So, and what's exciting with technology is that it's evolving so fast. It's
Yeah.
evolving so fast that even from those days, from what was happening in Nepal till today, and what we are doing, what we are able to do sitting in a little shack in South Delhi today
Yeah.
is completely, it was unimaginable even in 2015 when the GIS maps were being made. I'll come to that in a moment. But I think also in this last 1 year with the pandemic, the one good thing that the pandemic did is that it drove digital
Yeah.
stuff, digital, not just digital economies, but it drove digitalization in organizations and in sectors like no CEO has ever been able to do.
I agree.
Uh, and so a part of that is the way we are interacting now, and
Yeah.
and these conversations, which we probably they were technically possible, but they were not mainstream
Yeah.
till a year and a half ago. But more importantly, there's far more advanced technology that is now available to start figuring out how will we address this problem, which we were
Yeah.
talking of a few moments ago, where we don't know the future. The future is not based on trends. It's changing very fast. We have to literally learn as we go.
Yeah.
We will have to see the change happening and be able to plan in real time and execute the plan in real
Yeah.
time, because tomorrow it will be changing in a different direction, right? That's I don't want to use the technical term big data, but that's actually an issue of a lot of data. That's
Yeah.
big data happening out there, right? And even with the little cell phones that we all have, most of us have in our pockets
Yeah.
nowadays, there's data being generated all the time.
Yeah.
So while we couldn't do it very efficiently when COVID was spreading, or even if it's spreading as we speak today, it is right now technically possible to trace people a lot more than Arogya Setu and other apps are doing.
Yeah.
There, we need to learn a bit more, and we need to learn a bit faster on how to behaviorally get people onboarded, and how to also tie a few loose ends around these things. But
Yeah.
it's a very affordable technology that can disaggregate plans to the individual's level today,
Yeah.
and it can track those in real time, and it can help people respond in real time. So one of the exciting programs that I'm also linked with is this artificial intelligence for humanitarian action, AI for
Okay.
HA, a call that comes out from Microsoft. It's a global program.
Yeah.
And a small piece that we are doing in India and in Indian cities right now is to literally, like you said, you could be sitting anywhere and you were mapping. It's just that 5 years ago, we were mapping manually with GIS
Yeah.
software. And now we are training software to learn how to map.
Oh,
Not
wow.
only map, to learn how to interpret and
Yeah.
learn how to respond to it. So to explain it in a very simple way, now it is possible to access pretty high resolution satellite imagery.
Yeah.
Even in the maps that you have on your phone, whether it's a Bing map or a Google map, for a lot of places, the satellite imagery behind it is at 30 to 50 centimeter resolution.
Yeah.
Some of it is a little fuzzy, because legally, with the latest revisions in India, we can go up to a meters resolution for any maps that we want to generate and be
Yeah.
able to share with people. So that's the limit that we are working with right now, legally bound to that. But technically, it's possible to even go more than that.
Yeah.
And if you fly drones, which we are able to do now
Yeah.
legally in a number of places, you can get imagery in real time at a 5 centimeter resolution, right?
Wow.
So you can literally see any object more than 5 centimeters, but with the satellite image in your pocket, you can see any object that's more than a meter
Okay.
in size,
Yeah.
which means that you can see every rooftop.
True.
Right? You can, from that image, figure out what the material of the rooftop is.
Yeah.
Right? And if you then apply, if you use human understanding and intelligence and transfer it to machine learning, by looking at the sizes of roofs and how closely they are clustered,
Yeah.
you can identify which part of Bombay or Delhi or Surat is a slum and which part is a high income area.
Wow.
You can identify which part is has reinforced concrete buildings, which are 2, 3, 5, 10 storied high, and which part is single storied buildings. You
Okay.
can identify the lay of the land. You can see the river where the water is going to come from, and you can identify how the water will fill as it fills in these areas. Now,
Wow.
if you put these 2, 3 things together, you can find, let's say in Surat, as the water levels increase, or as you're getting warnings from the Met or
Yeah.
CWC on flows, you can literally in real time simulate how water will fill in different localities.
Yeah.
And now you know where is there a house or a cluster of houses which is in the low-lying land, which is very tiny roofs,
Yeah.
about 5 square meter roofs, obviously slum houses, very
Yeah.
tightly packed together. You can make out these are tiled roofs or thatch roofs or tarpaulin roofs, which means that they can't be having good solid walls,
Yeah.
and they can't be having solid foundations. They
Yeah.
are low lying, so they are in soft soil. They're
Yeah.
so small that they can't have a toilet inside. They're so tightly packed and small that these families can't be having insurance. They
Yeah.
can't be having good jobs and bank accounts and assets to fall back upon. They
Huh.
obviously are migrants. They don't have a social network in the city. You can
Yeah.
infer so much from that one image
Yeah.
and a tile of that image. And if you can teach your system to interpret it, you can run that in real time for an entire city, all the cities
Wow.
in a state, a few hundred cities. And your warning can be of the nature that Puneet, your house is going to see 2.5 meters of water in the next 3 hours. It will come from this direction. It will stay for an hour. But since it appears that you have mud mortar walls, it may be best to evacuate. The best house to
Wow.
go to may be Hitesh's house, which is two buildings away, but it's a concrete house with 3 stories. So, and this is the best route that you can take, or any center
Wow.
that we point to. That's what we have the capability to do as of today in affordable costs, sitting in our shacks in South Delhi or your
Yeah.
library in NIUA. So that's the excitement that we need to be also having, along with the despair that we see with situations that are going bad around us. And
Yeah.
that's what we need to tap into, both from the technology side, but also from the angle of policy, to make this usable and put it for widespread application, from the point of view of skills, so that we can indigenize it. It can be a
Yeah.
made in India program that runs with deep rooted understanding, with an understanding that bridges technology and traditional wisdom, and it
Yeah.
brings good stuff from all these domains together. Puneet?
Wow. This absolutely sounds exciting to me, and it's something that I do get excited when I see, like, okay, there is still a good amount of hope that is there. There's still a good amount of optimism in technology when we are looking at it and how it can actually, help us make things better. So I think to one of the last questions that we generally ask is on the lines of what kind of skill sets are required, and which you can cover in generality, but I would also like try to focus a bit on technology aspect of it, that how can what kind of skill set would someone require to be able to develop this kind of solutions, uh, to be able to volunteer into such kind of things, as well as make their ventures out of it, because I'm sure that there are a lot of non-profit startups also working in this sector.
Okay, so I think that's a great question, and a great question to start winding up with, because it sets a call for action. And as you started, let me also respond with a more generic, thought process.
Yeah.
And I've been reading about this a lot. That it's being said that children who are in elementary school today,
Yeah.
and I have a kid there, and you may have kids or cousins or nieces and nephews, but
Yeah.
or grandchildren. But these kids will, when they grow up to and come out of college to seek jobs, about 2/3 of them will be in jobs that don't exist today.
Yeah.
So my generation, and you're younger to me, so you've seen films and you've read that bit where there was a time when the choice used to be ki doctor banoge ya engineer, right?
Yeah.
And everything else was like the dumps.
Yeah.
And from there we grew into a lot of other things. We did a lot of creative stuff. We mixed and merged professions. But the fact is, the way we can't project into the future around what disasters will hit us and what tools we'll have to learn very fast to do that. Similarly, on skill sets, whether it's for elementary school going children or young professionals who are entering the streams as of today,
Yeah.
or those of us who may still want to be working for a few more years, we need to learn like crazy.
Yeah.
uh, what we've been doing even till last year is not going to help us next year. We will be obsolete, and we will be pretty redundant. So we all need to really pull our socks up. And I don't want to talk about sectors, because a lot of this will cut across sectors, but especially for any youngsters who are entering these domains and beginning to make their careers,
Yeah.
I would say that at the core of it, problem solving has to be your forte. It's not about, you can't walk an already walked path. There is no beaten path that will take you anywhere in 2021, if you're trying to look at a future. So the ability to anticipate, uh, and to work with problems, and to be able to find not a solution but a range of solutions that you can play with, that you can fail with, and you can fail very fast and learn very fast and improve, that's what's going to keep you ahead in the race. And that's, I know, a very generic thing, but I think that's critically important. In terms of skills, I would talk about two things. I would say one is logic, be able to see the larger picture and then run the logic of how this system is operating. It's not about solving the problem of building. I spent years ago trying to work on retrofitting, seismic retrofitting in the Himalayan region. I still am very passionate about it. But I realized that by the time you've retrofitted 20 school buildings, 50 new schools have come up which have, built more risk into it because you could not fix the system. You were trying to fix a band-aid on a huge problem, right? So systemic logic, systemic problem solving, a part of that will be answered by technology, like we spoke about artificial intelligence, real-time modeling and response. A part of it will have to be answered through, devising and planning new institutional systems that will respond to these kind of challenges that we will see. And the last, which we haven't spoken about much today, may seem a little unrelated, but I think we need to work a lot on communications. And a lot of the investment that we are trying to make in disaster resilience is failing because we are not able to communicate it well. We just assume that transferring knowledge or setting up a certain set of infrastructure will solve the problem. And then too late in the day, we realize that till people are convinced, those who are supposed to run the system and those who are supposed to benefit from it, till they are convinced, till we move beyond knowledge and skills to get into attitudes, till we get into intent, till we understand the human mind and the psychology that runs behind it, this awareness generation has not delivered, and it is not going to deliver, in my opinion. We have to get into behaviors and behavior change and human psychology and the psychology of cities in particular, since we're talking urban today. And that would be my thinking and my advice, at least to the youngsters, Puneet.
No, I do agree. And I do agree on the communications point. I absolutely believe in that. And because of that, we have a specific episode on those lines called on communicating climate change specifically, because we do believe that it's not just a simple thing about, okay, we are prepared and we have built capacity. That's not going to work. It's not for the masses. It's for the people or administration, whatever that is for. When you want to reach out to masses, you need to have good amount of communication that everyone learns how to take it forward, and that will be very important. I absolutely believe in that process. So I would just like to ask if I have missed out on any point that you would like to cover before we close off this thing.
Hey, I think you asked everything that's worth asking. Good set of questions. I can't think of anything, Puneet.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anshu. This was absolutely wonderful interview that I could do with you and understand it in a much better context, understand much more about technology and how it can be path-breaking in this field. Thank you so much for your time.
Great pleasure, Puneet.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, check out our website www.niua.org/c-q. The show is conceptualized, produced and edited by Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate at CQ. You can now subscribe to our podcast on your favorite channel, which can be accessed through the credits. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media for more updates. Do share your reviews with us and help us spread the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Do write to us if you would be interested in learning about any specific topics. Thank you and stay tuned for our next episode.